My guest today is Adam Zivo, investigative journalist, columnist for the National Post, and director at the Center for Responsible Drug Policy. We discuss his recent documentary series, Government Heroin, which focuses on the failure of Canada's safe supply drug experiment, the diversion of safe supply opioids to unwitting teenage users, and the strange relationship between the OxyContin epidemic and the new emerging catastrophe with safe supply narcotics. Adam is a lone, courageous voice speaking out against the devastating effects of safe supply programs, and is fearless in his ongoing effort to confront the powerful forces intent on creating a new generation of addicts. Stay tuned. Adam Zivo, my brother, welcome back, man. It's good to talk to you again.
Good to talk to you, Sue. Thanks for having me back on the show.
Yeah, dude. Well, I watched your documentaries and I was like, I have to reach out. Like, we have to talk about this because, you've been on the safer supply beat for some time now. I would say when it comes to Canada's safer supply programs, you are the guy. You are the guy to talk to. You know more about this than anyone. I jokingly told Sam that you're the Sam Cooper of heroin and opiates. Yeah. And so, I watched these documentaries and, especially the second one, both of them are fantastic, just incredible. For people watching and listening, you can check them out on YouTube. They're called Government Heroin. They're just unbelievable. But the second one, you kind of dig into the story of specific subjects. And one of them is a young lady named Camilla Sword. Can you talk about her a little bit and kind of tell her story?
Sure. So Camilla Sword was a young girl who lived in Port Coquitlam, which is in Metro Vancouver, about 40 minutes outside of downtown. And she was happy. She lived with her father. He was a working class guy. She would post TikTok videos of her playing, dancing, and then the pandemic happened and lockdown really destabilized her mental health. And so during that period, she connected with a new crowd of friends who were a bit more questionable, and she began experimenting with drugs. And starting at around 2021, she started using something called a dillies. So this drug is hydromorphone, which is an opioid that is as potent as heroin, if not more potent, and it's distributed by Canada's safer supply programs. And these programs essentially give out large amounts of addictive drugs to drug users under the assumption that this will stabilize these drug users because they no longer have to find money for these drugs because it's all given away for free, and that it will dissuade them from using riskier illicit substances. The problem, though, is that hydromorphone, although it's as potent as heroin, is nowhere near as strong as fentanyl, which is what most people use. Fentanyl is 50 times stronger. So if I give you a bottle of hydromorphone and you're used to fentanyl, the hydromorphone isn't going to do anything for you. It will, at the most, manage your withdrawals. But that's not what you want. So you do the rational thing in this situation. You sell your bottles of free hydromorphone. And I want to stress that the bottles are given to you with really no supervision. It's just the trust system with people who are using drugs, which is insane. Yeah. And you sell that to get the drug that you want. You get this illicit fentanyl. So your illicit fentanyl habit is being subsidized by the government, not mitigated. And this floods communities with illicit hydromorphone, with pharmaceutical hydromorphone from safer supply, which then crashes its street price by up to 90%. So an 8 milligram pill, which used to cost $20, now costs between $1 to $5, depending on how you buy it. You can get it for cheaper if you go directly to where safer supply is dispensed, like in downtown Vancouver. And for context, just 2 or 3 of these pills is enough to induce an overdose in a new drug user, like a teenager. Well, what happens to these drugs? Who is buying all of these diverted drugs? Well, the fentanyl users don't really want this. So they're selling it. They don't want it. So the hydromorphone disproportionately goes to opioid naive users, for example, teenagers like Camilla. And that's exactly what happened. So Camilla had a friend by the name of Madison. That's the pseudonym I gave her. It's not really her real name. Okay. And Madison was dating a guy named Logan. That's also a pseudonym. I interviewed Logan when he was in recovery in the spring. So Logan was also from Port Coquitlam, and he had some underlying mental health issues. A lot of his friends were in gangs, so he ended up joining the Brothers Keepers gang when he was, I think, 14, 15, quite young. And they put him in the downtown east side, and he started to sell fentanyl and other drugs. And he started to buy safer supply hydromorphone. And he said that whenever he was on the street, he would buy hundreds of pills a day, because you would have the same safer supply patients coming to him every single time with 14 hydromorphone pills. Hydromorphone is also known as Dilaudid, that's the brand name, or Dillies, right? And 14 is the maximum amount that can be prescribed per day under usual provincial guidelines. So obviously we can see this is from safer supply. Why are people getting 14 free pills a day that they're selling basically for nothing? He would buy all of these pills along with his other gang members, and then they would take most of them to the trap house operated by the Brothers Keepers gang. They'd put it all in a big bag. They would calculate how many they purchased, and then sometimes they would ship these drugs across the country. In one instance, they shipped 20,000 dillies. That's enough for several thousand overdoses to Ontario. Now, what Logan did is that he also took some of these pills back with him to Port Coquitlam, and then through Grace, he was introduced to her friends, and he would start selling it to these young girls who were 13, 14, 15 years old. And he would downplay the risks. He would say that it's just a pain medication, because essentially hydromorphone is a pain medication like OxyContin. It's a pharmaceutical opioid. Of course, pain medications are a wide umbrella. Hydromorphone is not nearly the same as, for example, a Tylenol or an Advil, but a 13 or 14-year-old isn't going to understand that distinction. No. Additionally, Logan emphasized the fact that this was safe supply. It was safe because it was from the government. It was uncontaminated. It was prescribed by a doctor. And so the girls took it because they didn't know what it was. They didn't know it was dangerous. It was super cheap. It was easier than getting a tall can of beer. It was ubiquitous. And right away, they got addicted. And so, one pill, a few pills a week became pills every single day, became many pills a day, became bottles and bottles and bottles of pills. And they would feel like zombies, Camilla and her friends. And they said that when they didn't have it, they would get irritable. They would get angry because they were going through withdrawal. And over time, two of Camilla's friends escalated to using fentanyl, because that's what happens. Your tolerance goes up over time. And for them, they needed something stronger. And then eventually they went to rehab, and now they're in recovery, and they're in that film. However, Camilla was not so lucky. For her, at the age of 14, she was found dead in her basement, in the fetal position, with a bit of foam on the side of her mouth. Her grandparents found her. Her father, Greg, found her shortly afterwards. She was zipped up in a bag. She was taken away, and Greg was shattered by the experience. And he knew that Camilla had a substance abuse problem. She had gone to the hospital a few times. He had begged for assistance with her addiction, but was told that she couldn't get care unless she consented, because it's her body, her choice. In Canada, generally speaking, youth have a lot of medical autonomy. So if you're a mature minor, you can consent or withhold consent to medical procedures, including addiction care. So she withheld consent to be treated. There was nothing he could do about it. And even if he wanted to treat her, the public beds are very difficult to get access to. There are too few of them, and private treatment costs tens of thousands of dollars. And for a working class single father like Greg, there was no way that he could afford that. So he did his best. He would get phone calls saying that his daughter was flat out drunk in parks, finding out that she was using drugs all over the city. And he would go and find her in his car, and he would drag her back home, even when she would punch him, kick him, scream at him, call him a piece of shit. And he would do this even when her friends protested. At one point, one of her friends pulled a gun on him, but still he did what he could to save his daughter, but it wasn't enough. After she died, her friends, the two that I mentioned, Amelie and Madison, they told Greg about the dillies because Logan kept on trying to sell dillies to them. And they were aghast by that. And so he, at that point, learned what hydromorphone is. He learned how Safer Supply had contributed to the addiction of his daughter and her death. And he even checked her Snapchat. He ended up getting access to it and found that drug dealers still were trying to sell her dillies, Safer Supply. The other girls, they said that they would go to downtown Vancouver and they knew it was Safer Supply because they would go down there. People would say, dillies, dillies, dillies. It was ubiquitous. And then they would buy from the Safer Supply patients with the drugs still in their prescription bottles. This is not ambiguous where it's coming from. And at some point, there were some occasions where, for example, Madison would go and there'd be a homeless person and the homeless person wouldn't have any dillies. So she would wait outside the pharmacy while the homeless person went inside, got his Safer Supply, came out, and immediately sold it to him. So shortly after Camilla died, Greg received a call from the coroner. And the coroner said that there were 3 drugs of importance in Camilla's blood. And that was hydromorphone, MDMA, and cocaine. And so based on those findings, physicians said that it's almost guaranteed that she died of hydromorphone because cocaine and MDMA overdoses are vanishingly rare, especially amongst youth. For them, if you get an overdose, essentially what happens with these drugs, especially cocaine, which is a stimulant, is that it overstimulates your heart and it creates a cardiac arrhythmia. Yeah. But if you suffer from, cardiac arrest, from using too much cocaine or anything like that, it's usually because your heart is weaker, you're older, or if you're young, it's because you have a genetic defect or some other disease. So the thing is that, if you overdose from cocaine, it's because it overstimulates your heart and causes a cardiac arrhythmia. Now, that's something that will happen to you if you are middle-aged and you have a weaker heart, or if you've been using cocaine for many years. And if you're a youth, it could happen to you if you have a weak heart because you have a genetic defect or some other disease which has caused some sort of structural damage to your heart. Camilla had neither of those things. And so it seemed very unlikely that she would have died from MDMA or cocaine, and that it was much more likely, based on that preliminary information, that she died of hydromorphone. And then that began, Greg's questioning, well, why did she die of hydromorphone? Where did that hydromorphone come from? And then that questioning, that journey, turned him into a national figure when he eventually went to the national media, through me, to talk about how Safer Supply had killed his daughter.
Yeah. I'm so glad you told that story because I don't know if I'd be able to keep it together. I watched it again last night and, I'm a dad, right? I have a 13-year-old son. I have a 7-year-old daughter. This is our worst nightmare. Every parent's worst nightmare. This is the worst possible thing that could ever happen. And, to know that this young 14-year-old vibrant girl died because of drugs that are issued to addicts by our government is infuriating. And I do not understand why we keep moving forward with this. Now, I know you have something you want to say, but I just want to say this to our listeners. This is not an isolated scenario. This isn't, she's not an exception to the rule. I grew up around East Vancouver where we were getting into drugs and alcohol around 12, 13 years old. The difference is that the accessibility wasn't there, right? If you want to buy a point of heroin or you want to buy an 8-ball of cocaine, you need to have some money in your pocket, and like real money, $50, $100, $150. If you want to buy a dilly, you can buy it for as low as $1. You can walk down to the Lower East Side of Vancouver and buy a government prescribed dilaudid pill for $1. That's less than a beer, than buying a single beer at the liquor store. You could buy 10 dillies for less than what it costs to buy a 6-pack. How does this happen? Adam, can you go into, like, how did we get here?
Well, so one thing I want to emphasize, building on your earlier point, is that not only is it incredibly cheap, youth do not realize that this is a dangerous drug.
Right.
When kids hear heroin, they know that that will destroy their lives. But when they see just a hydromorphone pill, it's just a pill, it's from the government, they're more willing to experiment. And that in itself is as dangerous as the incredible affordability of this drug. But to answer your question about how we got here, well, I mean, it's a little bit complicated. And there's a history here. And there are some reasons why safer supplies seem like it could be useful as an experiment. So essentially, historically, we tend to treat addiction using, opioids, but there are different classes of opioids. So this is called medically assisted therapy. Essentially, starting in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, doctors began to treat addiction with long-acting opioids like methadone. So methadone is a long-acting opioid that you take once a day. They give you just enough so that it manages your withdrawals, but not so much that it induces euphoria, right? And so what that does is that it doesn't provide you with that euphoric effect. You're not impaired. You just don't have to go through physical withdrawals. And medically assisted treatment is associated with far higher rates of success than just going at it completely with abstinence. Because, abstinence is very hard when your body is screaming in pain because you're in withdrawal. Now, what happened is that when methadone first came out, the doctors who had pioneered it essentially said that methadone is really useful to stabilize people to a certain degree, but it's not enough. You have to provide additional psychosocial supports to reintegrate people back into society and to change their sense of self so that they can become healthy individuals. If you are only giving them methadone and you're not addressing the underlying reasons why they're addicted, then the moment the methadone is removed, the person will go back to using drugs, right? You're not actually treating the underlying causes of addiction, you're just managing the symptoms. However, providing those services is very expensive. And so that area was really underinvested in for many years. Now, Canada started using methadone a bit later than the United States. I know, for example, in Ontario, I believe they started using it in the late 80s and 1990s through a doctor named Dr. Martin Judson out of London, Ontario. He wrote the provincial guidelines. He is an acquaintance of mine and also a very big critic of safe supply. Now, methadone, Suboxone, which is another form of OAT, opioid agonist therapy, they were effective, but at the same time, not many people wanted to provide these drugs because there's a stigma attached to addiction, right? People thought, well, okay, if I provide methadone, if I provide Suboxone, then I'm going to attract the wrong kind of clients and it's going to be dangerous and risky and maybe it'll harm my other business. And so the way that this was worked around is that Canada started providing incentives to people, paying them, to provide methadone and Suboxone so you can have enough supply of addiction treatment. But as is always the case, some people found a way to abuse this. And so in the 90s and 2000s, you had a deterioration in the quality of care because you had methadone providers who were giving methadone in the fastest and least responsible way possible. So they would see their patients for 5 minutes, give them their methadone, and then that's it. And then they would, ask for many urine tests, as many as possible, because that would maximize their revenue, even if the patients were stable and didn't seem to need urine tests. So addiction medicine in this case became a cash cow for certain people who took advantage of the system, and patient care really suffered. And it was only made worse by telemedicine, because telemedicine is useful in some contexts, but in this context, it allowed doctors to increase their patient load in areas where it would have been better and practical for them to see their patients in person, which then meant fewer connections with your doctor, less psychosocial support. So that is one factor. Addiction medicine, traditional addiction medicine it has its flaws. Now, on top of that, you had the rise of something known as IOT, so injectable opioid agonist therapy. And so what happened is that some patients didn't respond well to methadone or Suboxone because they were more intense drug users. And so their opioid tolerances were really high. And so it was harder to get them on the appropriate dose of methadone or Suboxone. And so an alternative was essentially to do injectable heroin under very tightly controlled circumstances. So they did some trials, the Naomi and Salome trials in Canada, where they took a few patients who were severely addicted and they gave them injectable heroin, every few hours with witness consumption. And these people were given significant wraparound supports like housing supports and psychosocial supports. And those trials suggested positive results. Now, there was a problem though. Whenever you provide someone with wraparound supports, that's going to increase their life quality. And from my understanding, these trials didn't put enough of an effort to determine whether the positive results came from the wraparound support or the injectable heroin. At the same time, even if there were flaws in that methodology, the treatment didn't have so many trade-offs because everything was witnessed and therefore you really couldn't divert these drugs. This is what we see in Switzerland with their IOD system. They have injectable heroin too. Well, now you have this harm reduction movement, which has been percolating for over 20 years. And they say, okay, well, current addiction medicine has its flaws. We see that injectable heroin works to a certain degree. Why don't we just create safer supply where we give people hydromorphone, addictive drugs with no supervision? And so what they basically did is they took the evidence base for IOD and they contorted it beyond recognition to justify the rollout and expansion of safer supply. Now, it's interesting because the justification for safer supply has evolved over time. It was first piloted in London, Ontario in 2016 by a doctor by the name of Andrea Sarita. And she initially pitched this as a way to stabilize vulnerable sex workers, because the idea is that if they didn't have to sell their bodies to procure drugs, then there would be less of a reason for them, to engage in sex work, and they could stabilize. And this would manage infectious diseases. This would protect them from street violence. And that was approved. And then very quickly, the scope of it was expanded to providing drugs to all kinds of users, regardless if they engage in sex work or not. And so in those first few years, the data seemed to be great with this program, which was located at the London Intercommunity Health Centre. And policymakers said, wow, this is innovative. This is great. This is saving lives. But there was a problem. And the underlying problem here is that there was no real evidence, because the evidence that was being produced at this clinic was incredibly low quality. So they had two kinds of data available to them. So the first kind of data that they relied on was small-scale qualitative interviews with safer supply patients. And what that means is that they would interview safer supply patients, and then they would present these findings basically as objective fact. So they say, hey, do you think this program benefits you? Are you diverting your drugs? If so, why? And of course, drug users are not stupid. They know how to lie to researchers to get what they want.
Right.
Yeah. Anyone who's known a drug user will know that they're very cunning. And I think that the fact that, people treat this research so seriously shows a kind of paternal approach to drug users. This idea that just because they're addicted, they're stupid. No, they're not stupid. Their brains are hijacked by addiction, but they know how to get what they want.
Yeah.
And so they would say, yeah, we're not diverting. This is great, yada, yada, yada. And then that was portrayed as evidence of success. Now, the second level of study is that they would give surveys to the patients. And, the surveys would then be turned into numerical data. And numerical data, of course, always seems more concrete than an interview. But of course, the data is still fundamentally self-reported. So suddenly you have this pilot project, it's doing great. We're saving lives. We have this big problem. And then on top of that, fewer and fewer people are responding well to OAT because fentanyl comes in. And with fentanyl, because it's 50 times stronger than heroin, your tolerance really goes up. So it's that same problem where it takes longer to titrate you onto methadone, onto Suboxone. And then because of that longer titration period, it is more difficult to keep patients. So that once again added to this idea that we need to have safe supply. Well, then in comes 2020, we have the pandemic, and an organization by the name of the BC Center on Substance Use, the BCCSU, produced a series of clinical guidelines very quickly, they say. I mean, it's a little bit strange. And they advocated for the nationwide expansion of safer supply on an emergency basis because of the pandemic. And the argument was that if drug users cannot access their drugs, if they can't go on the street and buy their drugs because of isolation, then they'll experience withdrawals, and then that will force them, to go outside, and that'll be dangerous for everyone. So why don't we just give them pharmaceutical alternatives instead? And mirroring what happened in 2016 in London, so this was used to ram through this policy. And then, of course, the scope quickly evolved, and it became a permanent project, not an emergency one, where you just had people permanently giving out large amounts of addictive drugs, opioids, and stimulants with very little oversight. And that's how we got to where we are today.
Wow. My God, I have like a billion questions after that. So I want to return back to Camilla's story a little bit here, because I think this highlights a few of the issues that came to mind when I was listening to you. So when she died, there was only a toxicology exam done on her body, and there was no autopsy performed, correct?
Yes.
Why?
Okay, so this is a whole other drama and should be a scandal.
No.
And I hope that this is properly investigated by people who have who have actual institutional power versus just one guy who's doing investigative journalism. So essentially, they did their toxicology report. They verbally explained it to Greg. Greg didn't hear anything back for a while, which is normal. It usually takes about a year to complete a death investigation. And so I connected with Greg in May of 2023, and I wrote about his story. And his story went, on the National Post. It was shared a lot. It created a national scandal, and it seemed to inspire the BC government to conduct a review of the program. But still, the death investigation was missing. We thought, well, where is it? When is it going to come? And we were a bit concerned because the chief coroner at that time, Lisa Lapointe, she was a huge, huge safer supply advocate. And what I really want to stress here is that she was not qualified to be an advocate in this way. So there are different ways of running death investigation systems in different jurisdictions. At the top level, the most rigorous level, is the medical examiner. So essentially, everyone has to have a specialization in forensic pathology. And then you have a coroner system where the coroner has to have a medical degree. And then you have what BC has, which is a coroner system where you don't have to have any relevant qualifications at all, right? So you can become a coroner, and you have, there's no need for you to know anything about medicine, about the body, biology. You could come in with a dance degree, a gender studies degree, and it would still be accepted. You get very cursory training on the biology of death, of addiction. And so Lisa, she is a product of this system. So she was a lawyer by training, but she didn't actually have a medical background. And then she became the chief coroner, and she changed the system so that instead of requiring, a majority of overdoses to be sent to autopsy, only a few are. And there's a reason for this. So essentially right now in most parts of Canada, 80 to 100% of suspected overdose deaths go to autopsy. But that creates backlogs because, the addiction crisis is so crushing. In Alberta, I think they have about a year backlog, but don't quote me on that because, I haven't looked too carefully into the data. In BC, they were able to turn around these death investigations quicker by reducing the quality of the investigations and only relying on toxicology reports plus, additional investigation, whatever that looks like. So Lisa, she did this. She reduced the amount of autopsies done. She became a big advocate for safer supply. And so you had these addiction doctors, on the ground saying that safer supply doesn't work. We're seeing in our clinics that it's being diverted. And then you had Lisa Lapointe, who is some, random lawyer who has become the chief coroner, who has no medical background. speaking over these medical professionals with the assistance of people who have a background in public health. Now, this is an underappreciated element of the tension on this policy. So the people who oppose safer supply tend to be addiction medicine practitioners. They tend to be people with medical degrees who practice medicine on the field, who work in clinic, whereas the people who advocate for safer supply disproportionately tend to be public health experts. Now, public health is an important field, but it is not the same as having a medical background. It is kind of like a humanities degree equivalent of getting a medical background. So it's much less rigorous, you know. It's fundamentally a humanities degree with some stats.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I just want to interject here really quickly because you mentioned earlier that hydromorphone was found to be Camilla's cause of death. And for our listeners, I don't want to confuse you. I just want to circle back really quick because you did have a forensic pathologist look at her file, right?
Yeah. So anyways, sorry, looping back into this. I'm giving you all the context.
Okay, cool.
I'm having a whole bunch of books.
Yeah.
In mind. So the problem here is that we suspected that she had taken a political approach here. And this is something that I am worried about and other doctors are concerned about. And so we thought, okay, when is Camilla's death investigation going to come out? And so August passed, it was a year. And then in October of 2023, I heard from a doctor that they said, oh, they had heard through the grapevine that the coroner was going to list her death as being caused by cocaine and MDMA, and this doctor was livid. And then lo and behold, Greg received Camilla's death investigation, her coroner's report, I think on December 20th or 21st, which is crazy, right? Mm-hmm. And then he had 10 business days to respond. So you give a grieving father the death investigation on December 20th or 21st and say you have 10 business days to respond. How is that fair? And so he immediately sent that death investigation, the coroner's report to me. And look, I have absolutely no background in this area. I just read a lot and I thought, okay, well, let's just check the numbers to the best of my ability, understanding that I am not an expert in this field, and see what we find. So I started to pull up, what's found in her blood, what are the average levels. So first of all, the MDMA found in her blood was 90% below, typical toxicity levels. So it was very, very low. Oh yeah, they said that she died of a cardiac arrhythmia caused by MDMA and cocaine. Sorry, I just want to clarify that. Right. She didn't even have cocaine in her blood. She only had, I think, benzoglycogene. I never know how to pronounce it, which is the metabolite, which is produced by the body when it metabolizes cocaine. So your body metabolizes cocaine, and then it produces benzoglycogene, however you pronounce it. It's abbreviated to BZE. Yeah. And the level of BZE in her blood was also fairly low. So it would suggest that, maybe she only had a little bit of cocaine at the time of death. And cocaine does break up in the body post-death. So it is possible that she still had some cocaine in her blood when she died, but, it doesn't seem like there was much. And then she had hydromorphone also in relatively low levels. And she also had fluoprazolam, which is a counterfeit benzodiazepine. And a benzodiazepine is basically like Xanax, and it's also depresses your system. So if you mix an opioid and a benzo together, that significantly increases the risk of death, of overdose. So what does all of this mean? Well, I made a little report of Adam's little quasi forensic analysis based on what he did. And I was like, okay, I'll send this over to a few doctors and see what they think. And they said, yeah, actually, this checks out. This seems pretty reasonable. This doesn't seem to make much sense. And as we dug deeper into this, we realized it's like, okay, well, she wasn't sent to autopsy. So how do we know that she died of a cardiac arrhythmia? Because a cardiac arrhythmia is essentially, your heart starts beating irregularly, and then you have basically a cardiac arrest. Mm-hmm. You can know if someone's had a cardiac arrhythmia maybe if you watch them have a heart attack. But aside from that, it's very hard to say that someone has that. So it's kind of like the bullshit cause of death that you can fall back upon if you don't really know what else to say. At least that's what a former senior coroner that I spoke with in January said, though I can't identify this person. uh, and so we say, okay, well, there's no way that you could confidently diagnose a cardiac arrhythmia. There is no autopsy, so we don't know if she had any structural damage near her heart that would have made an arrhythmia more likely. They didn't do any genetic testing, so we don't know if she had any genetic defects that would have predisposed her to cardiac arrhythmias. So it seems like the coroner just pulled this diagnosis out of a hat. Now, why does this matter? Well, if someone's going to die of a cardiac arrhythmia, that means that they died of MDMA or cocaine, because it means that essentially, MDMA cocaine causes that.
Yeah.
Diagnosing cardiac arrhythmia excludes the possibility of hydromorphone and benzodiazepines, fluoprazolam, because now you're not saying the heart was depressed. So it looked like they used a bullshit diagnosis to rule out hydromorphone. At least that's the sense that we get. Of course, there needs to be more investigation before saying anything conclusively. We also said, well, okay, the coroner said from where any of these drugs originated from is unknown. And it's like, what the fuck do you mean it's unknown, right? So typically, a death investigator is supposed to interview the people close to the deceased to figure out how they died. Mm-hmm. No such interview was done. Greg was never interviewed. Camilla's friends were never interviewed. And they had been in the national media at that point for months saying that Camilla accessed diverted safer supply drugs. So you have this coroner saying, well, we don't know where the drugs came from. We never interviewed her loved ones. They're just saying in the national media that's from safer supply, but we're not going to interview them. Mm-hmm. And there's no way that the coroner's office would have been unaware of what they were saying in the media, because first of all, it was a national scandal. Second of all, I literally reached out to the coroner's office to ask them about the safer supply thing when I first reported on Greg's findings. So it was very suspicious that they didn't interview these loved ones. So we looked at all this and we said, okay, something seems to be off. It looks as if the death investigation was potentially politicized in some way. Obviously, we can't say that conclusively, but that is the concern that we have given the available information. Then I spoke with some forensic pathologists, and one, Matthew Ord, who is in my documentary, said that when you have a complex polysubstance death like this, where it's very difficult to determine what actually caused the death, the best practice in this case is to list every major drug as the cause of death. So for him, he would have listed the cocaine, MDMA, hydromorphone, and fluoprazolam as the cause of death. And so hydromorphone would have been included. It's unclear why they excluded it and didn't follow best practices. And one of the reasons why he says this is important is also for epidemiological purposes. So we can see what drugs could be contributing to death. And so if this happened in Camilla's case, where it appears as if hydromorphone was inappropriately removed as a cause, as contributing to death, then it would appear that the coroner service is warping our epidemiological data to conceal to a certain degree the extent to which safer supply is contributing to overdoses and deaths. This is what we suspect, but once again, for us to say these things conclusively would require a full investigation with people who have far more investigatory powers than I do.
Yeah, well, I'll say it because I know that you have journalistic integrity and I don't. So I'll say this just reeks of a cover-up. And now I have to ask, I mean, just purely based on observation, right? We don't have any evidence to suggest that there's any wrongdoing here, but we do have, observational skills. So does it look to you like the hydromorphone component was swept under the rug or they attempted to hide it because Camilla's dad went to the media and was, very vocal and speaking through you and gaining attention nationally and so therefore they had motive to try to gloss over the hydromorphone component of Camilla's death? Or is this something that happens on a regular basis where hydromorphone is purposely left out of the equation?
I don't have enough information to say that, and I don't want to speculate about the motives of these parties, with any strong sense.
Sure.
What I can say is that at the very least, it strongly appears as if Camilla Sword's death investigation was botched. Whether it was botched intentionally or not is unclear to us. I am concerned that it might have been intentionally botched. I would like to see an inquiry, a public inquiry into this to verify this, ideally with experts coming in to analyze it who are not under the direct control of the BC government or the BC coroner. I would also like to see other hydromorphone-involved deaths, whether for youth or others, to be investigated as well, to see whether best practices were followed there too. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much the most that I can say.
Okay, fair enough. I don't want to lead you into speculation territory here because there's too much to cover. Now, I want to talk about Lisa Lapointe for a second. What is her connection to Safer Supply?
Well, as mentioned before, she's become one of the largest Safer Supply advocates in the country. I mean, as a chief coroner, she politicized her role and she used it to advocate very forcefully for the legalization of drugs. I don't attribute any negative intentions to her. I don't think she's doing it out of any sense of corruption. I'm not accusing her of corruption. But what I would say is that based on the content that I've seen from her, based on her interviews, based on the way that she has conducted her work, she seems deeply ideological and not always evidence-based. And her grasp of the evidence sometimes seems fairly weak. Mm-hmm. And so she, for example, published a report advocating for the expansion of Safer Supply that came out last year. She advocated for full drug legalization, which is insane.
Yeah.
And that recommendation was rejected by the BC NDP because they saw that it was politically toxic. And then shortly afterwards, she left her job. So she retired, I believe, in early February or late January of this year. And now she continues to advocate for Safer Supply, although she is much less effective at it because she no longer has the benefit of her office. But I know that she appeared in some Safer Supply video, and I know that she has a close relationship with the BC Greens, and that she seems to hold a lot of sway over their addiction policymaking.
Okay. So I want to talk about diversion here for a minute because, again, like as parents and just people listening to this, like, it's easy to talk about these people as numbers. It's easy to say this percent is diverted here and X amount of people are becoming addicted and so on and so forth, right? And as parents, we always think, well, that's not my kid. My kid's not doing any of that stuff. And I guarantee you, Camilla's dad thought the same thing. That's why it took him so long to figure it out, right? And now part of me blames youth culture for this sudden uptick in the use of things like Dilaudid and Galaxy Gas and so on and so forth. They call it Galaxy Gas now. When I was a kid, we called it Whippets. But the point is that youth culture does a lot to promote drug use. And, pills, prescription drugs like Xanax and Percocet and now hydromorphone have kind of entered the picture, right? But the thing that really gets me about this story and about Camilla's story and just all the stories in general is just the lack of accountability on the side of the government. It just seems like they are fighting tooth and nail to justify Safer Supply. I mean, what's your opinion on that?
I would say that I would agree. There's a complete lack of accountability. And I think that there are interesting parallels between the OxyContin crisis and today. So for listeners who don't know, the OxyContin crisis is essentially the whole reason why we have an opioid crisis in North America to begin with. So before the 90s, opioids were very rarely prescribed for pain purposes. They were very rare, hard to find. They would be prescribed when treating people who were in severe chronic pain, who were in severe pain, for example, cancer patients. That was the main use case at that point. And then in the late 90s, there was a company by the name of Purdue Pharma, and they produced something called OxyContin, which was oxycodone, put in a long release coating. So it was supposed to last you, 12 hours. But people discovered that if you just, wipe off the coating, then you can get the full hit right away. And what they did is that they said they marketed it as safe. They misrepresented some old doctor comments and said it was a study that said that only 1% of people develop an addiction from opioids. What the study actually said, first of all, it wasn't a study, it was a letter to the editor from one doctor like decades ago where he said that, 1% of patients in a tightly controlled hospital setting who receive opioids will develop addiction, which is very different from handing it out on the street.
Right.
They misrepresented that. They said that opioids are safe. They poured astronomical sums of money in creating a network of ostensibly independent organizations, like I think the American Pain Foundation, which advocated for chronic pain patients and advocated for more liberal opioid prescribing practices, but were really getting checks from Purdue. And then on top of that, they paid money directly to doctors and essentially bribed them either with gifts or kickbacks to prescribe opioids. So opioids, very rare in the early to mid 90s. By the 2000s, they're everywhere. And you have a few bad actors who realize that they can make a lot of money on this. There's a 2015 book called American Pain, which details this quite horrifically, where you have like these two guys who essentially were bodybuilding bros who, previously sold steroids, decided to create pain clinics, and they hired like their stripper girlfriend to like work as the secretary. They had, garbage bags of cash. It was really like something out of a gangster film. Right. And they would just prescribe and dispense millions upon millions upon millions of doses of OxyContin, which then goes and gets resold. And oftentimes this was covered for free. This was covered by Medicaid, so it was for free for many patients. And you had, in some circumstances, in some communities, people diverting and OxyContin because their disability was being cut, their welfare was insufficient, but they knew if they said that they were in chronic pain, they could get these drugs to sell. So that was their form of income. Now, why does all of this matter? Doctors say that safer supply is essentially OxyContin 2.0. We are flooding communities with quote unquote safe pharmaceutical opioids. We know what that looked like. The last time we did it, it was disastrous. People got addicted and they died. And we know that, if you like what's funny here is that because of the Medicaid system, I mean, the way that people received OxyContin in the US was very similar to how people receive safer supply in Canada today. No cost, free pharmaceutical opioids gets diverted. For some reason, we think that that this is different. Like this happened a generation ago. This issue was resolved 15 years ago, somewhat. So it's not as if this is something from a long time ago, from 50 years ago. No, we remember this. Many of the doctors who are practicing today went through this. Mm-hmm. We, as a country, launched a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit against Purdue Pharma. And there was just a settlement that we signed, I believe, last year or 2 years ago. So we are signing a settlement with Purdue saying that you owe us huge sums of money because you flooded our communities with cheap, pharmaceutical opioids. And now we're doing the same thing. But here's the difference. And this is what I think is particularly pernicious, is that with OxyContin, the principal agent moving all of this was Purdue and a handful of other pharmaceutical companies. And so they have a power above them, which can hold them accountable. And that power, of course, is the federal government or state government, well, any real level of government. In Canada, the primary agent moving safer supply is the federal government and certain provincial governments. And so there is no one above them to hold them accountable. So whereas Purdue, someone could hold them accountable, here with safer supply, they can't. And there are very strong political incentives to continue this program because it would be politically toxic to admit that this program that you championed as being an innovative solution to the addiction crisis is now getting people addicted to drugs, flooding communities with opioids, subsidizing the illicit fentanyl market, and getting kids hooked. So the liberals don't want to admit this. They lie about this again and again and again. The BC NDP have continued to lie about this again and again and again. But I know behind the scenes, at the very least, they are trying to distance themselves because they are concerned about the eventual blowback, both politically and legally.
And Dilaudid is the opioid that is prescribed to addicts through the Safer Supply program. Who manufactures Dilaudid?
And here we go. So Purdue Pharma manufactures Dilaudid. And this is something I'm very interested in exploring because, with any kind of drug, you have your brand and you have your generic. So what happens, of course, is that, a company will come out with a brand name. It's more expensive because that markup subsidizes the R&D cost of developing that drug. And then after their patent expires, generics come out. The generics and the brand, they're supposed to be interchangeable, so you can use either of them, whatever. The brand is always a bit more expensive, or sometimes significantly more expensive.
Right.
With Dilaudid and generic hydromorphone, so Dilaudid is about 7% more expensive. Our safer supply programs strongly prefer Dilaudid over hydromorphone. That's why the street name for hydromorphone is Dillies. But it's unclear why that is. And so, the 7% difference doesn't mean that we're being ripped off too much, but money is flowing to one company versus others, which I think should raise some eyebrows. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. The first way is that you can say generics and brands are interchangeable if you use them as intended. So these are oral drugs. You're supposed to swallow them. But the problem is that most safer supply patients, they crush their oral use drugs and then they inject it. And that also creates a whole bunch of problems because the particles don't fully dissolve and then they flow through the blood and they get dislodged in the spine and then cause debilitating infections and abscesses that leave people sometimes paraplegic. That's a whole other problem. I don't know why we call it safe and then, don't warn people about these risks. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that if you're injecting, well, the quality of the excipients, that's the material that holds together the pill, everything aside from the medicine, is higher in Dilaudid. And so what I've heard from some healthcare practitioners is that Dilaudid may be easier to crush and inject, and so drug users may prefer it on that basis. Now, if that's the case, then it would seem that the federal government is preferring a drug because it's easier to inject, in which case they are condoning this method of use, in which case they bear responsibility for the infections that arise from injecting Dilaudid because they're making it easier to inject. They're condoning it. Now, if this isn't the factor, if this isn't the reason why, then we have no real explanation for why Dilaudid is preferred. And then we say, well, okay, why is all this money going to Purdue? I think that needs to be explored.
I think that if you were to figure that out, that you would open an entirely new can of worms, because it seems conspicuous to me, or suspicious, that our country sued Purdue Pharma for billions of dollars for launching an opioid epidemic that destroyed most of an entire generation, and are now purchasing opioids from that same exact company to support its safer supply program. Doesn't that seem a little bit hypocritical?
It is hypocritical, and I think it's odd, but at the same time, there aren't so many pharmaceutical manufacturers out there. Yeah. So I think that in itself, is not enough to say that there is some kind of malfeasance there, which is why we need to push for more investigation and to ask questions. But as of now, we don't have enough information to say with confidence that there is a problem here, only that we can confidently worry about it.
Yeah. I love how careful you are, Adam. I love it.
I'm not get sued.
So have you spoken to any government officials about this? Have you drawn the picture for anybody who's in a position of power to do anything about it?
Well, I mean, for example, I know that Michael Tibolo, who is the Ontario Minister of Mental Health and Addiction, he is against safer supply. He's against much of this harm reduction radicalism. And part of the reason why he's against it is because he's a addiction medicine health professional. He's an addiction psychologist, if I recall correctly.
Mhm.
And so he knows how to read studies, and he knows how to see that the qualitative studies are bullshit. And the conservatives as a whole, they understand this issue and they are very much against safer supply. I have tried to engage with the NDP and the Liberals. I tried to give a presentation in Parliament a few months ago. Only one Liberal MP attended. So Anthony Housefather, he was great. But what I'm hearing from my contacts is that many of them don't think about it or don't know much about it. And so from their perspective, they think that this is all just conservative propaganda. And this has been really frustrating and a difficult thing to deal with. So this issue has become very politicized, and the Liberals and the NDP keep saying that it's the conservatives who are politicizing it, which is partially true now. But I think that it was originally the Liberals and the NDP who politicized the issue. So before the conservatives really hopped onto this, there were, of course, doctors who were raising concerns about safer supply, and they often faced harassment from harm reduction activists. And they were told that they were crazy conservatives, even though many times, like, these doctors were actually very progressive. I mean, we have to keep in mind that addiction medicine as a whole tends to lean towards progressive personalities, because the kind of doctors who want to work with these marginalized populations tend to be more cognizant of social justice issues in this way. And so I know, for example, Dr. Vincent Lam, Dr. Sharon Koivu, they were some of the original high-profile critics of safer supply, and they were both very NDP affiliated. Dr. Sharon Koivu comes from an NDP family. Dr. Vincent Lam wrote a book on Tommy Douglas, the former NDP leader. And I remember when I was speaking with Sharon, she said she found it bewildering that her progressive allies, the people who she had that she felt that she had belonged to for so long, suddenly cast her out when she began to criticize safer supply. She was ostracized by some of them. She was insulted by many of them, and she found it bewildering that she was now working with conservatives. One of my favorite doctors to speak with, Dr. Lisa Bromley, she is based in Ottawa. And she initially didn't want to go on record when speaking with me. I mean, she spoke off record. I gave her a pseudonym. I think she was Dr. Indigo or Dr. Violet. And then eventually she went on record because she was at first afraid of harassment and professional repercussions. But when I talked to her, I say, hey, did you ever vote conservative in your life? Because I do this because I want to check everyone's political biases. Mm-hmm. And she said no. She says she's never voted conservative in her life. She's always voted liberal. She's always going to vote, for a non-conservative party. But she said she hates this. And I said, you know what? I'm a conservative. You're not a conservative. We have our differences here. Let's work together to fix this problem. Yeah. And it's been great seeing the cross-partisan support for reform at the clinical level. Doctors from all parties, all backgrounds, saying that there's a problem here. It's not political. But then the Liberals went and said that, oh, if you criticize safer supply, you're a crazy conservative. And then in response to that, the conservatives realized there's a scandal here. You can't just give out all these drugs and it's ridiculous.
Right.
So the conservatives are the only ones talking about this, which is a shame. And then the Liberals and NDP don't want to hear it. I've reached out to Liberal NDP politicians. They don't want to listen. I've reached out to Yara Sachs through private contacts multiple times. I know as a fact that she will never want to meet with me. She's the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction. And the thing is, so now you have all of these progressive leaning political consultants, reporters who think that this is all some kind of conspiracy. I had a conversation with Jesse Brown back in the spring from Canada Land. We met, I talked to him about safer supply, and I think he was a bit surprised that I had all of this information. And he said, he didn't give it as much thought because he just assumed it was, conservative fear mongering. But when you actually talk to me and you listen to me, it's like, oh, wait a second, there's reason here. And same with another very progressive, very, liberal plugged in political consultant who I spoke with in Vancouver, He said straight up, he said, I thought you were a National Post propagandist, but I can see now that, you're quite earnest. And it's like, okay. But I'm trying to meet with people to show them that this is real. I'm trying to talk to them through and how there are ways to solve this problem while being consistent with your progressive values. Because I don't think that this should, it should matter if you're a progressive or a conservative here.
Yeah.
I think that flooding communities with opioids is bad, but I can only meet with so many people. And so many of them have bought into this narrative that like, this is crazy. And then that perpetuates the problem.
But the politicization of this issue, I mean, like all issues, right? Like every issue has become politicized to, a deafening volume, right? But in this case, like these drugs are clearly being diverted. These drugs are clearly ending up in the hands of children and high school kids. These safe supply drugs are clearly creating a whole new generation of addicts, right? And why liberals or NDP or even conservatives, anybody wouldn't pick up the phone and say, hey, listen, we need to talk about this because this is clearly a failed experiment. I mean, I get it. If they were to publicly acknowledge that safe supply is a failed experiment, then it's another dent in the armor of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, because this was ushered in underneath them. I get that part, but at what point in time does the greater good not come into the picture, right? Like, at what point in time do we say, look, these are our kids, right? Like, this isn't the Pride Parade. This isn't, oil and gas. These are our children. We need to actually do something here. Like at what point in time do we just put the politics to the side and do the right thing?
Well, I mean, at a certain point, you have to make it politically necessary for people to change their policy positions. And we saw that with the recent BC election, where the BC NDP pivoted away from many of their more controversial and perhaps worse thought out harm reduction interventions, because they saw that they were bleeding voters because of it.
Right.
And here's the ironic thing with the federal government is that although they spend so much time saying that safe supply saves lives and this is all conservative disinformation, they're quietly winding down safer supply. So Health Canada did not renew the funding for many safer supply projects back in the spring. The ones that are renewed are only renewed for a year. They're in jeopardy. And so from what I'm hearing in my contacts in the addiction medicine field, the federal government knows that it fucked up. They know that they have to change this. And they've kind of stopped talking about safer supply. The last real public comment that Yara Sachs, Minister of Mental Health and Addiction, made about safer supply was back in February. So she's really stopped talking about it. So I find it kind of sad and a little bit, I don't know, comical that you have all of these progressives, Canadians, saying that this is all lies, this is all, conservative disinformation, because they're listening to a party which is telling them this, but secretly, quietly acknowledging that this is a real issue.
Yeah. And I mean, as a voter myself, I would actually be more open to the Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau and the NDP, although I don't see anything that could sway my vote in their direction in any time in the future. But I would at least respect them if they came out and said, listen, guys, we did this experiment. We didn't do it properly. We didn't have treatment facilities available. We didn't expand access to treatment, and we just didn't do it the right way, and we're going to put a moratorium on this until we can figure this out. Like, they would at least gain my respect if they did that. But instead of just kind of going quiet and fading into black, it's like there's just the lives of their citizens, and especially the kids in this country. It's just not a priority to them. That's what they're telling me, right?
Well, I mean, politics is always a dirty and complicated game. I think that one of the main losses here from this approach is that it will deny many victims their chance to find justice and be compensated for the damages inflicted upon them by the government. Going back to the Camilla Sword story, so back in August, Greg Sword, and Denise Fenske, who is the mother of Amelie, one of the two friends I mentioned before, they're both in the documentary. they launched a class action lawsuit against the federal government, the BC government, a number of safer supply prescribers, claiming that there was gross negligence in the way that safe supply was prescribed, that it was, it was negligently and recklessly marketed as safe, that not enough safeguards were put in place to prevent diversion, and that although these entities said that they did not support diversion, that in practice they seem to actually condone and encourage it. So there is a chance that these victims and the people who sign on to that class action lawsuit will see some justice. However, that's just one group of people. And had the federal government had the courage to say that this experiment has gone wrong and we need to make amends, then it would have been much easier for other victims to come forward and to get what is due for them. So I think that's concerning. And one last thing I'm going to add, sorry for the long monologue. When it comes to the politicization, we have to remember that although right now, because of just the circumstances, it's mostly being done by the BC NDP and the federal Liberals, that there is also a degree of minimization that's a bit more subtle on the Conservative side, at least at the provincial level in Ontario. So we all know that the Ford government doesn't support safe supply, doesn't support supervised injection sites. They're very law and order. And I get it, in many ways I agree. Maybe I don't agree with the full way that they're going about it. Sometimes it's like they're taking a hammer to things, but at the same time, in principle, on the broad level, I agree with them. However, what many people don't realize is that safer supply seems to be less regulated and almost like running more amok in Ontario. So right now in BC, as mentioned earlier, you can get 14 hydromorphone pills a day. In Ontario, you can get 30, 40, you can get more. From the addiction physicians I've spoken to, addiction medicine is collapsing in many cities because no one can keep their patients on methadone or Suboxone because everyone wants to go onto safer supply because it's easier. It's the easy way. So you have many people who are now relapsing because of safer supply and who are destabilizing if they're on methadone. But that's a whole different point. Now, one would imagine, given these problems, that the Ford government would do something about it, but they haven't. So there was a letter that was written by Doug Ford to the federal government a few months ago, and it was ridiculous. So essentially, what the Ford government said is that, federal government, please stop funding these safe supply programs in our province. We don't want them here. And we have no clue how much hydromorphone is flooding into our communities because of these programs. Well, that letter was bullshit. So there is a certain component of safer supply that is federal. The federal government does fund certain programs, but healthcare fundamentally falls under provincial jurisdiction. And if someone is receiving safer supply, it's predominantly done through the federal system. So you have a doctor who is going to prescribe you hydromorphone for this reason, to manage your addiction. And then you go and you fill it out like any prescription, right? So this is a provincial thing. It is permitted under provincial law and is permitted now under federal law. But there are ways that you can functionally ban safer supply prescribing in your province, which is what Alberta did many years ago. So Alberta doesn't really have safer supply. I think they have one patient who was able to successfully sue to protect access to her safer supply drugs. So the Ford government could try something similar. They could have the courage to do that, to ban safer supply prescribing, but they haven't. And then on top of that, they say, we have no clue where our hydromorphone, where the hydromorphone is going to, how much of it is going. And I'm sorry, but that's just not true. It's being dispensed through, provincial institutions. It's being paid for by OHIP, by our provincial healthcare system. So it shouldn't be that difficult if you have the will to find out where the hydromorphone is going. They don't want to do that for some reason. And the way that I see it, my analysis of it, is that it seems as if the Ford government is more interested in railing against Trudeau to make themselves look better than actually fixing the problem, because it's easier to blame Trudeau, who's like, he's evil, he's ruining everything, instead of saying, actually, this is our responsibility. We were asleep at the wheel. We need to come up with a solution.
Okay. Final question, because I know you got to run. How easy is it for the average person to get access to hydromorphone?
It depends. So, I mean, if you're going to get it through Safer Supply, the federally funded Safer Supply programs they have long wait lists, so it's hard to get onto those. But there are a number of Safer Supply prescribers that are not federally funded, and they're much larger in number. And essentially, in Ontario, you just have to go up to them and say, "Hey, I overdosed from fentanyl. I'm worried that I'll overdose again. Can you prescribe me Safer Supply?" And then you get your prescription. It's incredibly easy. There's no verification process, really, in many cases, especially if you have a low barrier one. So look, if you know a prescriber who is doing low barrier Safer Supply prescribing, very easy. As for getting diverted Safer Supply, diverted hydromorphone, you can go and buy it on Reddit, or you used to until I reported on that. Now I'm not sure if that's still a thing. And you can go down to any area where Safer Supply is being prescribed. You can buy it in the morning. So, for example, you can go on Rideau Street in Ottawa, and you can go at 8 or 9 a.m. when they give out the Safe Supply, and you can watch it being diverted, and you can buy it there. In London, Ontario, you can go to the area around Chapman's Pharmacy, which is across the street from the clinic, the London Community Health Center, and that gives Safe Supply. That's the one that I mentioned, that pilot in 2016. And you can also buy Safe Supply in that area. In Vancouver, you can buy Safe Supply like this in the downtown east side. Or you can ask drug dealers who are farther away from these areas, and they'll sell it to you at a higher price. So they'll buy it from the Safe Supply patients at $1, $2, and they'll sell it to you for $5 to $10. But if you want Safe Supply, it's not hard to get because we're giving out so much of it. I mean, according to a recent report, the Culkins report, which came out, I think, in June, there's so much Safer Supply being distributed, for example, in BC, to just 4,000 or 5,000 people. Actually, one last rant. They always say, "Oh, how is this a problem? There's so few Safer Supply patients." They get so many drugs that just these 4,000 or 5,000 Safer Supply patients in BC expanded the overall provincial pharmaceutical opioid market by 30%.
Holy.
So it's easy.
Yeah. Okay. I got just two last questions. You can answer them quick. I know you got to run. Okay. So just to kind of paint the picture for people, like the Safer Supply addicts or people who want to be on the program are being prescribed them. Some people are using them themselves. A lot of people are selling them on the street in order to buy fentanyl, which is what they're really after, right? Now, is there a financial incentive for these private prescribers to prescribe Dilaudid or hydromorphone?
Oh my God, yes. It's like a huge thing. Right.
I feel like I'm going to take you on another rabbit hole, but
I'm trying to keep it short. But
okay,
this is the thing that is so obscene. Okay, so let's say you have a patient who is stable on methadone, right? You see them every day initially because they have to come in, they get the liquid methadone, but over time you stabilize them and they come in maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks. Same with Suboxone. We have a drug called Sublocade, which is essentially an injectable form of Suboxone, more or less. And you come in and you get, your injection once a month, and that's it, right? And then it dissolves in your body. Well, a stable patient is only going to come into your clinic once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month, and then you can't bill the healthcare system as much, right? Because you're not seeing them as much. Mm-hmm. So if you have a Safer Supply patient who is by definition unstable, they're coming in way more often and you can charge way more for the services. Now, on top of this is a money-making machine for pharmacies. So I talked to one doctor who estimated that a pharmacy with 100 Safer Supply patients can make over $1 million in additional fees. Because let's say, for example, you have a Safer Supply patient coming in, they've got a prescription for hydromorphone, they've got a prescription for Cadian, which is basically a long-acting oral morphine. Maybe they've also got a prescription for Ritalin. which, they give stimulants as well. Well, then what happens is they come in every single day. You charge them a dispensing fee for each of these prescriptions every single day. Maybe you mandate that they consume like a tiny portion of these drugs under witness consumption. The rest gets taken away to be sold, but you witness a tiny bit of it. Well, then you get to charge a witnessing fee. So for all of these stakeholders, it is way more profitable to keep people in addiction, to keep them unstable, than to get them stabilized and to get them on actual medications with actual evidence that reduce interactions with the healthcare system.
Last question.
Okay.
When these safe supply drugs are being prescribed, who is paying for it? Is the person who goes in and picks up the prescription paying out of pocket, or is the bill being sent to taxpayers?
For the most part, the bill is being sent to the taxpayers. If I recall, some of the safe supply users may be on the hook for some of the dispensing fees, in some cases not. There is a safer supply program based in Vancouver where they give fentanyl tablets, and I think maybe fentanyl powder. No, just fentanyl tablets. And for that, they make you pay for it like any other regular prescription. But for the most part, it's free. That's why they sell it for so little, right? That's why they can afford to sell these drugs at $1 a piece. So we're on the hook. We're paying to flood our own communities with opioids. It's ridiculous.
And final question, do we have the data around how many young people are making the jump from hydromorphone or Dilaudid to fentanyl? Do we have a rough estimate?
We don't, but I'm going to throw a few stats at you, and I'm also going to include a few stats that I wanted to bring up earlier but forgot to.
Okay.
So first of all, the BC Coroner Service released a report looking at youth drug deaths, and report was released in 2023. And so it looked at youth drug deaths between 2017 and 2022. And so in 2017, 0% of these deaths involved hydromorphone, 2018, 0%, 2019, 0%. And then I believe in 2020, it's been a while since I looked at this data, it was like 5 or 6%. And then I believe afterwards it went to 9.6% in 2021. And then by 2022, it had gone up to 22.2% of youth drug deaths involved hydromorphone. And keep in mind that these deaths overwhelmingly came from fentanyl. So we have a huge spike now of youth who are dying from fentanyl but have hydromorphone in their system. So that would suggest that a significant portion of youth are graduating to fentanyl after using hydromorphone. And of course, this doesn't capture the people who have fully transitioned from using hydromorphone to fentanyl. So there's that. Another stat is that in Ontario, so earlier this year, CAMH released their student drug survey. So every 2 years, they survey high school students across the province, and they ask them about their drug use. And so the percentage of youth who self-reported using pharmaceutical opioids for recreational purposes, non-medical purposes, increased by 70% or so. And the number of youth who self-reported saying that, pharmaceutical opioids are easy to get also increased, I think by 40%, but I don't fully remember. And what I want to say, of course, is that, this survey has its biases because it relies on self-reporting. And of course, self-reporting is going to predispose you to certain populations. We don't really know. It's not a random sample, but the biases are the same year after year after year. So, I think in the most recent one, they said, 20% of youth used opioids recreationally. We don't know if that's true because of the biases in the sample data. But at the same time, we know that year after year, using the same methodology and the same biases, there was a 70% increase. And that is what is concerning. Last thing, because people keep on saying, oh, there's no data that safer supply is being diverted. I mean, there is data. I'm going to toot my own horn here and say this, because I kind of pushed for it. So this is going back to the institutional problem. So when I first started reporting this and investigating, I emailed the London Police Service, right? Because this is where Safe Supply began. And I said, hey, I'm investigating safer supply diversion. Can you tell me about it? And they said, no, there's no one who can speak on this issue. This was, I think, in March or April of 2023. So then in January, I speak with a high-level figure in the London Police Union, and they say that it's a well-known fact amongst frontline officers working in downtown London that safe supply is being diverted. And around this time, I heard from a credible source that the upper levels of the, of the London Police Service, that they didn't want to talk about safer supply diversion because they were afraid of the blowback that they might receive from certain social service agencies, which is really depressing. I mean, like, come on, just do your job.
Yeah.
So in March or late February of this year, there was a report of a massive bust of like 10,000 allotted pills. And when you see 10,000 allotted pills that all seem to be 8 milligram, it's like, okay, come on, there's a safer supply connection there. Like this is not obvious. Like this is not rocket science. It's really obvious here. So I emailed them. Well, I called them and then I emailed them and I said, hey, I sent them a list of questions. I said, is this connected to safer supply? Do you have any concerns about safer supply diversion in general? And to signal to them that I knew what was going on, I mentioned the fact that I had spoken to contacts who had said that it was well known amongst police officers.
Yeah.
And who had said, that this was known to be an issue. And I said, if you don't think that this is an issue, how do you reconcile it? It's my way to basically say, don't bullshit me because I'm asking you to explain, then how do you reconcile this? They didn't get back to me. They stonewalled me for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And then eventually they got back to me when I said that I'm going to do a report on this. It's going to come out next week. And this report is going to come out regardless if you tell me, if you answer or not. And then they gave me data. And this is what they said. They said that in 2019, only about 1,000 or so hydromorphone pills were confiscated by the police. That number increased significantly in 2020 when safe supply became widely available. I think it was like up to 2,000 or so. By 2022, it was 6,000 pills. And then last year, it was at 30,000. And this year, it seems to be on par to meet or exceed that. Now, my numbers might be slightly off because I haven't read this in months. But the main thing here is that from 2019 to 2023, it went from 1,000 pills to 30,000 pills. So a 3,000% increase, which is insane. This is insane.
Yeah.
And this is only a fraction of what is being confiscated from the black market.
That's what I was going to say. This is only what we know. And I just want to say, like, with the overdose death numbers that you gave earlier, in cases like Camilla's Sword, where hydromorphone is obfuscated as a potential cause of death, she's not included in those numbers. So we don't know the actual data, right?
That's the thing. We don't know, right? Because some of these deaths may be disguised as deaths that are not caused by hydromorphone, but have hydromorphone involved.
Right.
Now, after I got the data from London, so then they did a press conference about a month afterwards. It turns out they were doing a multi-month investigation into all of this. And they admitted, they openly admitted to me, the deputy chief, he's a nice guy. I know he's just doing his job. We had a few cordial conversations. But yeah, he openly admitted to me that the London Police Service appears to have stonewalled me in early 2023. I think he said it was shitty, something like that. Like, I think he used that word, forget. And he apologized for that. And then they went and they had a press conference and they said, yeah, this is what we found. And we have evidence to show that safe supply is being diverted en masse and that the highest level of organized crime are involved. And mind you, the federal government and BC government spent months saying this was all disinformation. This wasn't true. And now the London police say that it is. I then called a whole bunch of other police services. Many of them didn't get back to me, or they said that I had to put a freedom of information request in, which for me was a bit sketchy.
Yeah.
But thankfully, the Waterloo Region Police got back to me and the Niagara Region Police got back to me, and they were both lovely. So if any of them are listening to this, I want to say thank you guys. You guys were phenomenal. So they got back to me within my given timeline. And they were able to show similar significant increases in their regions/cities. So in Waterloo, hydromorphone seizures increased by over 1,000%. In Niagara, they increased by over 1,500%. So we can see across Ontario, hydromorphone seizures by the police are increasing by tenfold or more since 2020, when safer supply became widely available. Wow, I wonder why that could be. What is happening? No, it's like,
Yeah.
this is what the fuck.
Yeah. You know what? Let's close there. What the fuck? You know, like there's so many more lines to draw here. And, you know, Sam Cooper just recently published a report on the a U.S. congressional report, basically, you know, opening the books on China and their association to organized crime and the just mountains of fentanyl that are flowing into North America. We obviously have a huge problem with it here. Sam has done a lot of work to kind of expose the Liberal Party and other political connections to the United Front Work Department and other CCP associated organizations. And I think you are on the other side of that, showing how this all connects on the street level. And if you look at the big picture, I'm not going to draw the lines here for everybody just because I don't want to speculate and drag you into something that you might not be able to get out of. But if you draw the lines and you put the big picture together, we have a real big fucking problem. And Adam, I'm so glad you're doing this work, man. Like, I'm not just saying this. I really believe that you and Sam are the two most important journalists working in our country. You guys are part of a very small club. And I'm so happy that the two of you so frequently work together, because I think that you're both just top of the mountain journalists. And for people out there, please watch the Government Heroin documentaries. Both links are directly below this video. If you're listening on an audio streamer, it's in the description of the episode. Please watch this stuff. Please read Adam's work. We talk so much about propaganda, left-wing propaganda, right-wing propaganda, but we never put focus on the real journalists, the guys who are real journalists, the ones who are really doing it. And Adam, you're one of them. You're part of a very, very small handful of people that are still out there, exercising real journalistic integrity. And my friend, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for talking to me again. I would talk to you for 6 hours about this, but I know you have other more important things to do. Adam, before we go, can you just tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter/X at Zivo Adam. So that's my handle. And you can also find my organization's website. So I run something known as the Center for Responsible Drug Policy. You can find our website at www.responsibledrugpolicies.com. Very easy to remember. And we also have a Substack called Break the Needle, and you can find that at breakingneedles.com.
Adam, man, I can't thank you enough. Honestly, I watched your documentary, and Camilla's story really hit me hard because I have a daughter. And look, people, you do not understand how easy it is for your kids to slip away. Right? When this happens to kids, we always look at the parents like, well, what did they do wrong? These are bad parents. No, sometimes your kids just slide through your fingers, and you hope that you can grab them before they hit the ground, but sometimes you can't. And the work that Adam's doing is so important in terms of us just reducing the ability for us to lose our own children within the society around us that is supposed to be a safe place for us to be. And Adam, thank you so much, man.
Well, thank you for the kind words. Yeah, it can happen to anyone. Any family can lose a child to addiction. And I hope that with voices like yours, raising awareness of this issue, and I guess with mine, investigating it, hopefully we can save children's lives, because what is happening right now is catastrophic.
It's catastrophic. Adam, I want to have you back in a month or two and do this again, because there's so much more to talk about. But in the meantime, man, everybody, please go read Adam's work at National Post. Go follow him on X. I mean, this is the guy for this issue, and this opioid issue is a big one. So please go follow Adam. And Adam, thank you so much, man.
Thank you for having me.